Did you know that in an era when European powers were carving up Africa like a pie, one nation stood its ground and delivered a stunning defeat to a would-be colonizer? This isn't the plot of Black Panther's Wakanda, but a real story from history. The story of Ethiopia and the legendary Battle of Adwa. In the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. European nations were brutally colonizing one country after another. Italy, a relative newcomer to the colonial game, set its sights on the ancient empire of Ethiopia. They thought it would be an easy conquest. They were wrong. On March 1, 1896, near a town called Adwa, Ethiopian forces didn't just defend their land, they achieved a victory so decisive it sent shockwaves across the globe and inspired anti-colonial movements for decades to come. How did they do it? Let's dive into one of the greatest stories of resistance in world history. To understand the significance of Adwa, we need to rewind a bit. For centuries, European contact with Africa was mostly limited to coastal areas, largely for the horrific transatlantic slave trade. By 1870, Europeans controlled only about 10% of the continent. But then things changed, and fast. The scramble for Africa began, and by 1885, a handful of European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and others had divided nearly all of Africa among themselves. At the peak of this colonial frenzy, only two nations remained independent: Liberia, a state created for the resettlement of free Black Americans, and the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia. Italy was eager to establish its own empire. To be a major power back then, you needed colonies. Encouraged by Britain, Italy occupied the Red Sea port of Massawa in 1885 and began expanding into the Horn of Africa. They established the colony of Eritrea on land that was formerly part of Ethiopia and also occupied parts of what is now Somalia. Tensions escalated, especially after an 1887 ambush where about 500 Italian soldiers were killed by Ethiopian forces. The stage was being set for a major conflict. In 1889, a controversial treaty was signed between Italy and Ethiopia's new emperor, Menelik II. Known as the Treaty of Wuchale, it was supposed to be a pact of friendship. Menelik agreed to recognize Italy's claim to Eritrea in exchange for weapons and money. But there was a huge problem. The treaty had two versions, one in Italian and one in Amharic, Ethiopia's language. And they said very different things. The Italian version stated that Ethiopia had to conduct all its foreign affairs through Italy, effectively making it an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version merely said Ethiopia could use Italy's services if it chose to. When Emperor Menelik discovered this deception, he was furious. He, along with his brilliant and politically savvy wife, Empress Tedu Batul, refused to be tricked out of their nation's sovereignty. They knew a confrontation was inevitable and began to prepare for war. Tetu, a fierce opponent of European expansion, was a key strategist and advisor. Together, they launched a two-pronged defense. First, they armed their people. Using the very loans and connections they had established, they acquired modern rifles, artillery, and ammunition, ensuring their army wouldn't be fighting with spears against cannons. Second, they launched a masterful public relations campaign. With the help of sympathetic Europeans, they worked to shape their international image. Menelik's Swiss-born advisor, Alfred Ilg, promoted Ethiopia as Africa's Switzerland, a neutral, mountainous, and independent nation. Articles were published in European papers admiring the Ethiopian court, often portraying the deeply religious Menelik as Africa's Christian monarch. He even traded recorded messages with Britain's Queen Victoria. Menelik, who claimed descent from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, became a well-known figure, projecting an image of a sophisticated and determined leader, not the savage caricature so common in colonial propaganda. Now, Menelik wasn't a perfect hero by any means. During his rise to power, he had brutally consolidated his rule over rival Ethiopian factions. But when faced with the common threat of Italian invasion, he did something remarkable. He united the country's historically fractious rulers. In September 1895, he issued a call for mass mobilization. The response was overwhelming. From all corners of the empire, from nearly every ethnic group, men answered the call. An army of somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 soldiers was assembled, a force that dwarfed the Italian expedition. With his empress by his side, Menelik led this massive army north on a grueling 5-month march. They covered nearly 600 miles, an incredible logistical feat that surpassed some of the most famous military campaigns in European history, like Napoleon's march on Russia. As the Ethiopians advanced, they scored crucial early victories. In December 1895, they wiped out a forward Italian column. Then they besieged an Italian fort at Mekelle. Here, Empress Taytu's strategic brilliance shone. She advised cutting off the fort's water supply, a simple but devastatingly effective tactic that forced the Italians to surrender. Menelik was not just a great mobilizer. He was a cunning general. He expertly used spies and spread false rumors, making the Italians believe his army was smaller, less organized, and on the brink of collapse from starvation. He outmaneuvered the main Italian force, slipping past them to choose his own battlefield, the rugged, mountainous terrain around the town of Adwa. The Italian commander, Oreste Baratieri, was in a tough spot. His supplies were dwindling, he didn't have accurate maps, and he was wary of the massive army he was facing. He considered retreating. But then, on February 25, 1896, he received a sharp telegram from the Italian Prime Minister, basically taunting him and demanding he take action. Pressured by his government and his own subordinate generals, Baratieri made a fatal decision. He ordered his forces, divided into 3 brigades, to advance and attack the Ethiopian camp. On the morning of March 1, 1896, the battle began. It was a disaster for the Italians from the very start. Their columns got lost in the unfamiliar, treacherous terrain and became separated. They stumbled right into a much larger, well-prepared, and strategically positioned Ethiopian force. The Ethiopians, fighting on their home ground for their freedom, descended on the disorganized Italians with overwhelming force. Menelik had successfully outsmarted and outflanked them in every way. By the end of the day, the Italian army was not just defeated. It was shattered and in full retreat, abandoning their artillery and thousands of prisoners. The victory was a national effort. Women played a vital role, carrying water to the front lines, tending to the wounded, guarding prisoners, and boosting morale. Empress Taytu herself commanded her own personal army on the battlefield. The scale of the Italian defeat was staggering. They suffered casualty rates of up to 70%. About 3,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner and marched back to the capital, Addis Ababa. In a historic turning of the tables, whites were now at the mercy of blacks in significant numbers for the first time. In contrast to the often brutal treatment under colonial rule, these prisoners were treated relatively well and eventually released. The aftermath in Italy was chaotic. The government of Prime Minister Crispi collapsed. The commanding general, Baratieri, was put on trial, though he was later acquitted. Most importantly, Italy was forced to sign a new treaty, one that unequivocally recognized Ethiopia's absolute independence. Other European powers followed suit, formally establishing diplomatic relations with Emperor Menelik's government. The impact of the Battle of Adwa echoed far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Before Adwa, the dominant European view was that Africans were destined to be ruled by them. This victory shattered that myth. It forced Europeans to take Africans, and their capacity for organized resistance, much more seriously. The story doesn't end there. Decades later, under the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, Italy would return with modern warplanes and poison gas to occupy Ethiopia for a brief period. But the spirit of Adwa never died. The victory in 1896 remained a powerful symbol, a beacon for future African independence movements throughout the 20th century. It became a cornerstone of Pan-Africanism, the idea that people of African descent have common interests and should be unified. And its influence is still felt today, even in pop culture. The fictional nation of Wakanda from the Black Panther comics and movies, the only African nation to have never been colonized, is a powerful fantasy. But it's a fantasy with a very real foundation. The foundation of Adwa. It's a testament to what a united people can achieve when fighting for their sovereignty, their dignity, and their freedom. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more incredible stories from history. See you next time.